There's a kind of silence that doesn't soothe. It doesn't calm, doesn't relax, it echoes loudly. That was the silence I met on the first morning of my retirement. I was 65, healthy, financially stable, married. On paper, I had done everything right. I had worked for 4 decades, raised children, paid off the mortgage, and finally stepped into the golden years everyone dreams of. That morning, there was no alarm. For the first time in 42 years, no one expected me. Not at the hospital where I had worked as a physician. Not in my inbox. Not even at the breakfast table. My wife still slept soundly beside me. The sun had barely risen, but I was wide awake. Not because I had to be, but because I didn't know how not to be. I sat at the edge of my bed longer than usual, my hands resting on my knees, staring at the carpet as if it might provide answers. The world outside the window continued without me, cars moved, birds called, children waited for school buses. And I was just there, existing, not living. You know, when people talk about retirement, they talk about freedom. They talk about travel, hobbies, relaxation, finally having time. But no one talks about the sudden death of structure, identity, and motion. No one tells you that if you don't prepare your soul, retirement will feel less like a reward and more like exile. That first morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee the way I always had, but this time, I didn't have anywhere to bring it. There was no desk waiting for me, no patience, no chart to review, no lecture to give. I sat in the kitchen, hands curled around the warm mug like it was a lifeline to my past. I remember the ticking of the wall clock. Every second seemed louder than it had been the day before. Tick, 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 as if time, now unbound by duty, was mocking me. I opened the newspaper, closed it, turned on the television, turned it off, walked to the mailbox and stood there even though it was empty. The stillness didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the walls were closing in. That day stretched endlessly, like an ocean with no wind, no tide, no sail. I called a few old colleagues just to hear familiar voices, pretending I had a casual reason. But what I was really looking for was belonging, because something strange happens when you stop being needed. You begin to question whether you ever truly mattered. I had spent years being doctor, the one with answers, the one people came to in pain and left with relief. I was a part of something larger, a system, a purpose. And then, overnight, I became just a man in his kitchen, a name on a retirement card, a ghost in his own home. That night, as I lay in bed beside the woman who had stood by me for over 40 years, I stared at the ceiling and whispered a truth I hadn't dared admit aloud. I don't know who I am anymore. Retirement hadn't broken me. It had revealed me. It stripped away the roles, the routines, the expectations, and left me face to face with myself. And what I saw was someone unprepared. Not financially, I had planned for that. Not physically, I still walked 3 miles a day. But spiritually, emotionally, existentially, I was lost. I thought I was walking into freedom, but I had walked into a void. That's the part no one puts in the brochures. The slow erosion of purpose, the hollow echo of days with no shape, the creeping doubt that maybe the best of you was already behind. I wish someone had told me, don't just prepare for retirement, prepare for what comes after. Because when the clock stops, the questions begin. Who am I without my title? What do I wake up for when no one's calling my name? What does it mean to grow old with dignity when everything familiar fades? That day, the clock didn't just stop on the wall. It stopped in my heart. And if you're not ready, truly ready, you'll find that the silence isn't freedom at all. It's a slow unraveling of the self, a quiet kind of death. But it doesn't have to be. There are ways to protect your soul from that silence. And the first begins with purpose. The days began to blend. Monday was no different from Thursday. At first, that felt like a gift. Freedom from the tyranny of schedules, no early meetings, no patient rounds, no paperwork waiting at the corner of my desk. But over time, the absence of obligation turned sour. I wasn't waking up for anything, I was just waking up. My calendar, once packed with responsibilities, was now an empty white field. And here's something no one warns you about. When the page is too blank, the mind starts drawing shadows. I began to invent tasks just to feel busy, watering the plants twice, rearranging the spice rack, counting pills in the cabinet like some kind of strange ritual. And still, I felt hollow. Because you can fill your day with movement, but without meaning, it all slips through your fingers like sand. That was my first and most painful mistake, retiring without a purpose. You see, work doesn't just give you a paycheck. It gives you a place, a reason, a direction. It's the compass that orients your day. Remove it, and suddenly you're drifting. And let me be clear, I'm not talking about going back to work for money. I'm talking about waking up with a reason, something bigger than yourself, something that whispers to you in the morning, "Get up, we need you." I had no such whisper. I told myself I would read more, maybe take a painting class, perhaps travel to places my job never allowed. But weeks passed and I did none of it. Because when you retire without a purpose, you don't just lose your schedule, you lose your momentum. Purpose is what gets you moving, and movement is what keeps you alive. Without it, even the healthiest body begins to rust. The sharpest mind begins to fog. I started to notice it. My memory wasn't as crisp, my energy less steady, my conversations shallower, and then came the questions: what's the point? Does anyone need me anymore? Am I just waiting to die? Those questions are poison, and the antidote is purpose. Not necessarily grand or world-changing, but personal. I met a retired teacher who started tutoring local kids for free, just 1 hour a week. She said it gave her more joy than 30 years in the classroom. I met an old mechanic who spent his afternoons restoring bicycles for neighborhood children. He said handing a kid their first working bike felt better than any paycheck. And then I met a widower who simply volunteered to read aloud to patients in hospice. "They don't remember my name," he said, "but they smile when I walk in." That's purpose. It's not about being remembered by the world. It's about being needed, even by one soul. Purpose breathes life into every step. It straightens your back, brightens your eyes. It gives rhythm to your mornings and peace to your nights. Retirement without purpose is like a boat untethered, beautiful, but drifting toward decay. But purpose is the anchor. It doesn't hold you back, it holds you together. So if you're approaching retirement, or if you're already in it, don't just ask, "How much do I have saved?" Ask instead, "What am I still here to do?" Because trust me, your heart doesn't retire, and neither should your reason for being. When I was 65, I thought I had it all figured out. I had a pension, some savings, the house was paid off. I'll be fine, I told myself. I've worked hard. It's time to enjoy the fruits. What I didn't realize was that aging, true aging, isn't just about gray hair and slower steps. It's a gradual, relentless shift in the economy of your body. And the older you get, the more expensive that economy becomes. Not just in dollars, but in energy, in resilience, in independence. The cost of aging doesn't show up all at once. It creeps in, subtle at first, almost invisible. A minor ache in the knee, a prescription refill here, an extra nap in the afternoon. But each small cost compounds until one day you realize you're paying more just to stay at the same place. I remember the day it hit me. A small fall in the kitchen. No major damage, just a bruised ego and a fractured rib. But that single incident unleashed a flood of bills, appointments, therapies, home modifications. And worst of all, a sense of vulnerability I'd never known before. That's the real cost no one talks about. Not just financial, but psychological. The cost of losing your certainty. The cost of no longer trusting your own body. The cost of depending on others for things you once did without a thought. And if you haven't planned for those costs, emotionally, financially, and spiritually, aging doesn't feel like wisdom. It feels like erosion. We often picture retirement as a flat line of spending, predictable, manageable. But here's the truth. After 70, every year becomes steeper. Healthcare alone becomes a mountain. Medications that weren't part of your life before suddenly have their own drawer. Appointments become a second job. Your time, once freely your own, is now brokered by specialists, procedures, waiting rooms. And the emotional toll? That's even harder to quantify. Your world shrinks. Friends move away or pass away. Your favorite restaurant becomes too loud. Driving at night feels like navigating through fog. These are costs, invisible ones, but they add up faster than you expect. And yet, so many of us retire as if the future will look like today. We base our budgets, our lifestyles, our expectations on a version of ourselves that no longer exists. We don't account for the decline, not because we're naive, but because we're afraid to face it. And so we underplan. We undersave, we overestimate our independence, and we underestimate just how much support we'll need. But here's the good news, because there always is. The cost of aging doesn't have to bankrupt your spirit. Preparation is power. Not fear, not obsession, just honest readiness. Talk to your doctor before you need constant care. Meet with a financial advisor before your savings are stretched thin. Downsize your home before the stairs become a hazard. Build community before loneliness sets in. Strengthen your body before it begins to betray you. Because aging isn't the problem. The illusion of permanence is. Nothing lasts untouched. But when you expect the waves, you can build your house higher. When you understand the winds, you can plant deeper roots. I wish someone had told me that at 65. I wish I'd known that the greatest cost of aging isn't just the money you spend. It's the freedom you lose if you're unprepared. But it's not too late. It's never too late to turn preparation into peace, to exchange denial for dignity, to look aging in the eye, not with fear, but with respect. Because the real value of life isn't how long we stretch it. It's how deeply we live it, even as the costs rise. You don't notice the silence at first, not when you're busy signing retirement cards, not when you're still attending farewell dinners or exchanging phone numbers with coworkers saying, "Let's stay in touch." The loneliness doesn't walk through the front door. It leaks in, through quiet mornings with no phone calls, through birthdays with fewer guests, through dinners where it's just you and the hum of the microwave. After I retired, I thought I needed rest, time to myself, space. I thought silence was peace. But over time, that silence started echoing, and not in a comforting way. You see, one of the most dangerous myths about growing old is that it's a time of retreat, that we're supposed to withdraw, step back, fade quietly. But human beings were never designed to live in isolation, especially not in old age. Social connection isn't a luxury. It's a survival tool. Your friends, your family, your community, they are oxygen for the soul. Without them, things start to wither inside, not just emotionally, but physically. Studies show that loneliness increases the risk of heart disease, dementia, even premature death. Being socially disconnected is as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Let that sink in. And yet, so many of us do it. We stop calling, we decline the invitation. We say, "I'm too tired." We think they're probably busy. We let weeks become months, and then wonder where everyone went. The hard truth is this: sometimes we're not abandoned. We slowly, quietly abandon others without realizing it. And by the time we feel alone, we've already burned the bridges through neglect, fear, or pride. I remember my old friend, Harold. We used to play cards every Thursday for nearly 12 years. When his wife passed, he withdrew. He said, "I don't want to be a burden, I'll be okay." For a while, we kept calling. He stopped answering. And eventually, we stopped calling too. A year later, I heard he'd passed. Alone, quietly, he didn't need more medicine. He needed someone to ask how his day was. We make this mistake because we assume connection is effortless, that it should just happen. But after retirement, relationships require intention. You have to call first. You have to invite others in. You have to risk vulnerability again. Yes, it's harder as we age. People move. Some die, some drift. But don't let the thinning of your social circle become a reason to give up. Let it become the reason to reach out more. Join something, anything, a book club, a walking group, a choir, a volunteer center, a community garden. Not because you're bored, but because connection is the antidote to invisibility. If no one sees you, you start to disappear even to yourself. And here's the irony. When we age, we finally have the wisdom and time to offer something truly meaningful. But if no one's around to receive it, that wisdom turns to dust. So don't wait for someone to knock on your door. Knock first. Ask a neighbor for coffee. Write a letter to an old friend. Forgive someone, apologize. Show up even if it's awkward at first. Because every time you open your heart, even just a little, you remind yourself, I still matter. I still belong. I am still part of the living. And when the time comes, because it will, when your body slows, when your days get quieter, it won't be your retirement account that saves you. It'll be the voices, the laughter, the hand that reaches back when you reach out. That's the real wealth. That's what makes old age not just bearable, but beautiful. The body doesn't retire when you stop working, but many treat it as if it should. We think retirement means resting, slowing down, putting our feet up and letting the world pass us by. But here's the truth. The day you stop moving is the day you begin dying. Not suddenly, not loudly, but gradually, like a house untended, crumbling in quiet corners. I've met many people who retired at 65 and aged 20 years by 67. Not because of illness, not because of genetics, but because the moment they put down their tools, they put down their will to move. They woke up with no destination, no reason to get dressed, no stairs to climb, no errands to run, no urgency in their limbs. And the body, sensing it's no longer needed, responded in kind. You see, the human body is a machine of momentum. It's meant to bend, reach, stretch, twist, walk, lift, dance, tremble, leap, live. And when it doesn't, it stiffens. When it's not called upon, it weakens. When it's not challenged, it forgets its own capabilities. We don't grow old and stop moving. We stop moving and grow old. When you were young, movement was part of your survival. You ran, climbed trees, walked miles without thinking. Even in your working years, movement was woven into the fabric of your day. But now, left unchecked, your world has shrunk to the size of your living room. That chair you sit in every morning, it's not comfort. It's a slow goodbye to your strength, your balance, your endurance, and eventually, your freedom. And let's be clear, this isn't about becoming an athlete. You don't need to run marathons or lift weights like a 30-year-old. But you must move every single day, because when you walk, your heart wakes up. When you stretch, your blood flows. When you climb, your lungs expand. And when your body moves, your spirit follows. I once met an 82-year-old woman in Kyoto named Michiko. Tiny, barefoot, strong as oak. She practiced Tai Chi in her garden every morning, like clockwork. When I asked her why she never skipped a day, she smiled and said, "Because if I miss one morning, my legs remember. If I miss two, my back remembers. And if I miss three, my soul forgets." That stuck with me. The body is not a burden to carry through old age. It's the vehicle of your presence, your power, your possibility. Think of movement not as a task, but a ritual. Not as exercise, but as worship. Stretch in the sunlight, walk after meals, breathe deeply on the porch, plant a garden, dance to music, carry your groceries. Let your days be filled with purposeful motion, not just survival, but vitality. Because when you move, the world moves back toward you. You feel capable again. You reclaim the dignity of independence. And above all, you whisper to your soul, "We're still here. We still matter. We are not done yet." And here's a thought to carry into tomorrow. The body you move today is the body that will carry your memories, your laughter, and your final joys. So take care of it, not out of fear, but out of love. There's a quiet voice that whispers in the ears of many retirees, "You're no longer needed." It's a voice that sneaks in like fog, soft, subtle, yet deeply corrosive. And when it takes hold, it convinces you that your best days are behind you, that your story has reached its final chapter, that you are, at best, irrelevant. I want to stop you right there, because this belief is one of the greatest lies we tell ourselves as we age. The truth is, you are needed now more than ever. Maybe not in the same way as before. Maybe not with the same job title, paycheck, or social spotlight. But your wisdom, your experience, your love, these are not just valuable, they are irreplaceable. Consider this. When a forest grows old, the oldest trees don't stop giving. They shelter the seedlings beneath. They feed the soil with fallen leaves. They create homes for creatures invisible to the casual eye. In much the same way, your role shifts, not disappears. Your value isn't measured by your productivity, but by your presence. Yet many retirees believe their usefulness ends with their career. I've spoken with countless seniors who felt invisible, passed over by family, overlooked by society, forgotten by their own reflection. They withdrew, convinced their opinions no longer mattered. They stopped volunteering, stopped mentoring, stopped dreaming. And in the silence that followed, a deep loneliness took root. But here's the secret. You have more power now to shape lives than you ever did before. Because life experience is the ultimate currency. It's a gift that cannot be bought or learned in books. It's the stories only you can tell, the lessons only you can teach, the comfort only you can provide. When you believe you're no longer needed, you give away your power. You let the world shrink around you, but when you claim your place, when you stand tall and say, "I am here and I still have much to give," you inspire everyone around you. So how do you reclaim this truth? Start small. Reach out to a younger family member with a question. Offer to share a skill or story at a community center. Write down your memories for the next generation. Volunteer in a cause that sets your heart on fire. These aren't just actions, they are declarations. Declarations that you matter. Declarations that you belong. Declarations that your life's purpose is still unfolding. I remember an old man named Joseph. He was convinced his usefulness ended when he retired from his factory job. But when his granddaughter struggled with math, he sat with her patiently every evening. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. Months later, she told her mother, "Grandpa makes numbers make sense." Joseph's belief in himself was restored not by a paycheck, but by being needed in a way that mattered deeply. So here's my message to you. Don't let the world tell you your value is tied to your job, your youth, or your fame. Your value is eternal, anchored in the very essence of who you are. You are the keeper of stories, the mentor of souls, the heart of your community. You are needed, and the world is waiting, quietly, patiently, for you to say yes. If I could turn back time, I would write a letter to the younger me. A letter not filled with regrets, but with wisdom earned through years of both joy and pain. Dear younger me, you are standing at the edge of a vast ocean, a sea of possibilities, fears, and dreams yet to be realized. Don't be afraid to sail into the unknown. Don't wait for the perfect moment to start living. Life is not a checklist to complete, but a story to be told with passion and purpose. I wish I could tell you to never retire your dreams, to never believe that your value is tied only to work or titles. I wish I could tell you to keep moving, keep learning, keep loving fiercely. Because the truth I learned too late is this: retirement is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of a new chapter, one that you hold the pen to write. The days ahead are full of untapped strength, unseen joy, and purpose waiting to be uncovered. Don't let fear, loneliness, or doubt steal your light. You are still needed. You still matter. You still have much to give. And it's never too late to begin again.